Everybody to the Imagination Podcast. I'm Tony Blair, and this is hosted by the PhD and THD programs at Kairos University. Our audience extends beyond that, however, because we're talking about things that matter not just to doctoral students, but to humans, and particularly to Christians. How do we engage in this world, and what is the role of imagination? Can we imagine perhaps options that have not been considered before, or pull some ancient options out of the toolbox and put them to work again? So this spring in particular, we've been talking to some people that are doing some good reimagining, helping us see things and imagine things and ask questions that need to be asked. We've been using a number of the faculty of the program, administrators within Kairos. Today we have one of our alumni, recent alumnus, who has been very creative, both in his work as a student, but also in his work as a professional. And maybe we go beyond that just in who he is as a person. I'm delighted to have Dr. Drew Littlejohns with us today. And Drew, I know you just have finished a book, so let's start there. Talk to us a moment about purple squirrels.
Yeah, so I just recently, well, came right off my dissertation here, and decided that I was going to utilize all that learning, all that writing strength, all that stuff I had learned, and try to immediately apply it to my business. So I run a nutritional supplement manufacturing company, and I also run an advertising agency as well. And so one of the things that I encounter all the time is this idea that people want the perfect candidate. They want the perfect fit or the perfect job at the perfect salary that will solve all of their stress. And it's in recruiting language, that's called the purple squirrel. So the book that I wrote was called The Purple Squirrel Paradox. I'm actually getting it printed here in the next few days and then giving my first keynote speech on it in a few weeks in Nashville. And so one of the things that's been interesting for reimagining is to say, well, how do I take all of the conversations I've had with people, whether it's in Zoom calls like this or wherever, and just how do I compile that into one giant database, give it to an AI, and then have AI then return to me an actual book based on everything I've been thinking and talking about with my friends, right? And then how long then can I actually use that information? And so part of it has a lot to do with one of the courses that I did here, which was I used an autoethnography as my
Mhm.
methodology, and so returning to that autoethnographic style to pull from all of this data, this personalized data, to write books. Right, that's one of the big things. Like, how do we actually use what we're learning here at Kairos and put it immediately into effect in our personal lives? So I did an autoethnography on my marketing strategies and was able to write a book, I think, in just under 3 weeks, start to finish,
Wow.
like concept to cover design and printing. So pretty exciting stuff here.
Well, that gives us all sorts of directions we can go. Let's pause for a moment, just a minor distraction, and talk about autoethnography. Again, this is starting to get heady for those of us who are not necessarily doing major research, but that was the development of that as a methodology was an incredibly provocative, controversial moment as well, because for most of the 20th century, the theory was that researchers need to be entirely objective. We need to be removed from what it is that we're researching in order to approach it with these pure objective external eyes and be able to analyze it well. And then people came along in the end of the 20th century and said, actually, no, that's impossible. We can't do
Mhm.
that. We will not be objective. And instead of pretending that we are, why don't we admit that we're not? And maybe even go one step further and say that what I feel, what I experience, my lived experience as a person, is in of itself a research topic and can be accessed. That was an incredible moment in the history of trying to figure out what the world consists of and understanding knowledge. What was your
Yeah.
experience? And just tell me a little bit more about your experience of autoethnography and why you chose that of all possible ways of understanding um, yourself a little
Well,
bit better.
I found that when I was doing my dissertation courses, so when I was learning the courses that I was working on, it was really important to me to use a very distinct and different methodology for each course that I took. And that was because I wanted to go into my dissertation with the most amount of kind of access to methods to be able to utilize. Now, I've been in AA for quite some time, and I say that to everybody, everywhere, all the time. It's one of the first things I say. And so I actually chose that as an autoethnographic method. And the reason I did that was because being an existentialist, which I am, um, phenomenology says we have to take everything that we're studying and we have to put it into an attaché. We have to set it aside, right? But with autoethnography, you're saying, I'm actually going to take all this stuff I'm supposed to set aside and I'm going to study that,
Yeah.
as opposed to I'm going to set it aside, pretend it doesn't exist so that I can do science now. And so I wanted to, because I've already been in that existential phenomenological state, I wanted to also be able to argue from the other side. It was important to me to be able to argue both sides equally well. Um, and I'm finding that has been the most enjoyable thing to be able to play with, because that way my study, my research, my business, I'm able to stay highly curious by just approaching any problem but from a different methodological angle, and it instantly changes your perspective. And now what looks like a mountain, if you change the perspective enough, looks like a valley, and now you can see things from these all these different angles. And I really believe that part of maturing as a person is the ability to hold the different tension that we experience in life,
Mm,
being able to
yeah.
hold it and sit with it. That's that Viktor Frankl idea of, can you sit in that tension, right? And then that's where real freedom appears. That's where real human dignity appears. Um, and that's just the kind of person I wanted to be as I went through the doctoral process.
And so it aligned with who your a philosophical commitment you already had and a sense
Mhm.
of identity that you already had. Now, I'm a historian, so I immediately started thinking of a story from 700 years ago because I do those weird things. But maybe in one sense, this is a continuation of a process that's been engaged since then. The story is the Italian author Petrarch one day in the late 1300s decided to take a walk up a mountain. Not a terribly high mountain, but he climbed a mountain. He came back down and wrote about it. And what was phenomenal, if we want to talk about phenomenology about that, is that that was a radical idea for the late medieval period, that somebody would do something like that, not for any pragmatic purpose, but merely for the experience of it. And I'm sure other people did, but Petrarch was the one that we know about here because he's the one who decided that somebody else might care about his experience in climbing a mountain and coming back down, and therefore he wrote it down. Isn't that autoethnography? Wasn't he doing that then?
Yeah, for sure. And as somebody who's climbed 58, 14,000 foot peaks in
Of course you
Colorado,
have. I
I
did
can
not
I
know
can
that part.
honestly say that I appreciate that he did that. And some of the best lessons weren't taught to me about mountaineering, were not taught to me in textbooks, avalanche guide, search survival training. The best lessons I learned were from reading memoirs, people looking back at their experiences.
Mm,
And I can think of a number of stories about that. One of the guys, one of the first Americans to really get up K2, and he talked about the whole time he was going up, he was imagining the catastrophe that had happened just 10 years earlier,
wow.
where a significant number of people died. And he chose that as his mantra to remember exactly what they did. And so looking back and looking at other people's experiences, looking at my own experience, it's something that I think now is really becoming a major way of how do we experience the world, especially with the amount of information and advertising and marketing that's pushed onto us. It's very easy to just receive all these projected images that other people want us to believe, that we may not necessarily believe about ourselves. And so autoethnography helps you to find your voice, to know what you believe when you think about yourself. It's
Uh-huh.
really important.
We hadn't intended necessarily to go there, and we will talk about AI, which is a primary topic I want to address with you. But I'm going to go off in another little detour because Drew,
Wherever you want.
I've always found you a fascinating person. I love when the very first conversation we had. I love the way you think, the way you approach learning, and the way you approach business and life. And So the other analogy that came to my mind, sticking to mountain climbing, which I have not done but have read considerably about and written about a little bit. George Mallory, who I still
Yep.
believe was the first person to summit Mount Everest.
100%. We all agree with you.
Good, 1924. But Mallory, in an era when mountain climbing was somewhat in its infancy after World War One, and the dominant metaphor that was being used, particularly by European climbers, was that of conquest. I'm going to conquer the mountain. Mallory tended not to use that language, and he's the one who famously said, when asked why he wanted to do this, just simply replied, because it's there.
Mhm.
And I love the simplicity of that. Why do it? Well, it's almost like, why not? It's there. There's an experience to be had, and I know how to do these things, and therefore, why would I not do this? Because this is who I am and this is what I do. He died on that mountain. That's why we don't know for certain if he got to the summit, was on his way back down, or somewhere else. So it's not an experience that he got to reflect on with us, but he did
Yeah.
it because it was there, because it was worth it to him, which I find fabulous.
Well, that's the philosophical question. When he said because it's there, what does he mean by it, right? And I honestly would argue that it in that context is because I am curious about it.
Hmm.
And I firmly believe that why, and so one of the things with me writing this book was I just wanted to see could a book be written from start to finish in 21 days? Could it be done? I was so deeply curious, and I spent maybe 5 hours a day just trying to see if it could be done. And I gave myself a very strong time frame. But I really believe that when asked, like, why are you doing something? If the answer isn't because it's there, why are you doing it? If it's not your curiosity driving you to want to explore that, it's a real dangerous thing because every time we say no to that curiosity, or every time we suppress the curiosity, now we're developing muscle memory for the suppression of curiosity. So even if what you want to do, even what you're curious about is weird, it's actually very important to say yes because you learn to develop the curious muscle.
Hmm.
And one of the most important things in self-determination theory, I don't know how much research we've all done into that, but really interesting to look into in terms of intrinsic motivation for getting tasks done. And one of the key elements that they talk about in self-determination theory is you have entered a deep state of intrinsic learning when you begin to develop theory crafting. And I think theory crafting is born from a place of curiosity, right? That we're curious. And so when you're looking at the mountain and you're deeply curious, you could go to the left, you could go up the shoulder, you could take the ridge, you can take the couloir, you can take, the switchbacks, you could rock climb the face, there's all these different routes you could take. And being curious about it prevents us from seeing the world as overly black and white, or the route is the ridge, or the route is the standard route, the trail. At the end of the day, learning to say because it's there and learning to exercise that muscle and learning to have enough self-love and enough self-awareness to say, I'm going to do this because I happen to think it's interesting and I don't care that other people may or may not find it attractive. I find it attractive.
And therefore it's not done for an audience. Maybe there's an audience for it. You're publishing a book that maybe you want somebody to look at, but
Absolutely.
primarily it's this experience. I had this experience myself last fall. I wrote two children's books for my two grandchildren for Christmas. I made
Love it.
them the focus of the story. So it was a book about them, by them, and using AI because I was curious about what it could do. I had it
Mm-hmm.
develop illustrations that included my children and their toys and their mothers and the whole thing. I built it around them and designed it around them and had AI help me develop the story and published it. It's available on Amazon. And much the same kind of thing, probably a smaller project than what you did, but I did it not because I expected anybody's necessarily going to find it on Amazon. I just wanted to know if it was possible, if it would be fun to do, and if
Mm-hmm.
it could maybe make my kids, not make my grandkids' eyes light up with a little bit of joy on Christmas Day. That was worth it
And
all
was
by
it
itself.
fun? Was it
Oh,
worth it?
it was great fun, and the learning experience.
Yeah.
with that. So let's use that because our time is limited here. Let's shift a little bit into this exploration of how and why and where we use AI, because it's the burning question of our generation,
Mm.
and particularly of this past year. You've been experimenting a little bit. You said to me
Yeah.
before we started here that there were ways in which you were delighted and ways in which you were not entirely comfortable with what you do. You experimented with as a student in this program.
Yep.
So
Yep.
give us a little idea what you've done and what conclusions you've reached about it for yourself, or what questions you
Yeah.
have going forward.
Yeah. This is gonna turn in just a brief philosophical diatribe, but just bear with me. Which is that the first instance of technology, the wheel, let's say, the wheel exists to reduce the friction or to decrease the friction from dragging. In theory, that's the point of the wheel. There is friction when you drag, so if you have a wheel, you reduce friction. Now, if you reduce friction, right, you reduce the amount of energy needed to get from A to B. This is really important to realize that I came up with a philosophical notion that all technology exists to reduce friction. And if we state that and we understand technology as a friction reducer, we understand that AI then becomes an extreme friction reducer. And in fact, AI feels like a gravityless environment. And so that's okay. We have lots of areas in the world today where we have so much technology that there almost is no gravity. So, what's the peril of being in a gravityless environment is that you have no resistance. Now, that resistance, without it, you're going to actually experience neurological entropy, right? Or like muscular dystrophy in your brain, right? It's going to actually atrophy. There we go. There's the word. So, what we have to be careful with when using AI, if we use it too much, or we use it for routine tasks, or we use it to help us get from A to B, we could actually atrophy our brains.
Yes.
And that's the big concern with AI. So I want to be really clear that the boundaries of using it is if you notice that in the using of it, you feel yourself getting less curious or playing the meta game where you're not actually trying to do a task, you're trying to think about how to do a task, and it winds up becoming a little bit more meta. Just step away from it for a moment, try to recalibrate as best you can before re-engaging with it. That was the thing that was the most interesting to me was that the task you're going to use AI for has to be so great, so difficult that you could never do it in a million years without it. And if you can get the task to be that difficult or that expansive, let's say, then AI actually doesn't atrophy quite as much. You're actually having to lift with the same force. You're just able to go 10 times further. Um, and so really those are constraints I try to use when thinking about AI. Am I trying to do something that's 10 times more difficult than I would ever be able to do by myself? An example of this is in my dissertation, where I'm trying to learn. I'm doing a bit on the Epic of Gilgamesh, just studying divine kingship. Okay, it was part of my thing, but I didn't have time to learn cuneiform, which is the ancient Sumerian form of writing. I just didn't have time for this. But I did have time to use AI and then parlay that in with to make sure that it was actually doing it correctly. And then all of a sudden, here it was. Now I can know cuneiform. I can actually look at the redaction writing methods of other cultures and compare that to how Egypt redacted their mythology and how Deuteronomistic history came into play and how the Epic of Gilgamesh came in. And then all of a sudden, when I began to look at certain aspects of the Old Testament, I was able to do it in a giant cultural way that I would never have been able to do before, and actually compare different cultural redactional methods. I'm only saying that because terribly fascinating. Tony, you know how difficult that would have been before AI.
Yes. I also know it's only possible because other scholars over the past three generations, maybe four, have worked extensively with cuneiform and have translated it and have made it accessible. So without that hard human effort, what you have done here through AI would never have been possible. It seems that's the partnership. Somebody is still going to have to do the grunt work in order to
Yes.
move knowledge forward, but others are going to be able to take that then and then make these connections that could not have been made by somebody who's got their nose deep in
Yeah.
a simple tablet from Sumeria.
Well, and that's really where AI, I think, shines in an academic setting. In an academic setting, I think AI really shines in interdisciplinary, research projects. Just projects that would require you to do an incredible, because AI doesn't do math well, right? It's terrible at doing math. It's also not really intelligent. Technically, it's just a really sophisticated math model that predicts the next word.
Noam,
Um,
Noam Chomsky, with whom I have seldom agreed, has called it, I love this one, he calls it the world's best plagiarism machine. Uh,
yep.
it
It,
borrows, steals freely, and raises all those ethical questions about how do we cite and honor previous work. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I
no.
think you were saying something along that line. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So as we're kind of growing through and learning, and I remember when I first got started, I emailed my entire committee and said, "Hey guys, what is the rules here? Like, what is the rules?" And then we developed a set of rules. We developed a set of guidelines that was specific to my project. And I really do think that every project actually has to be, from an AI perspective, what are you going to do in using it? Because some things are going to be, it's going to be very much not appropriate for.
Yeah.
And I found even in my own research, my own writing, trying to blend so many different disciplines together was very complicated. It was very difficult, and it was easy to get lost. Very easy to get lost. So, but overall, what a interesting time to be a student, to be a business owner, to be just all these different things. It's a very interesting time, to say the least.
It would seem that what you're getting at here, then, when you call it an interesting time, we started with curiosity. For those who are
Mhm.
inherently curious already, which, by the way, I would regard as one of the spiritual disciplines or virtues.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how you be a Christian without being curious, but maybe that reflects my own bias. If you have an innate curiosity, then we have this tool that will help us be able to explore more deeply, more widely, more fully what was not always available to us in the past. Without curiosity, however, it becomes a substitute for our own, well, for our own humanity. Do we lose something of our humanity, don't we, if we're not careful here?
I think we absolutely do. Well, what winds up happening is everything becomes teleological, and that's the great peril.
Talk more about that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, when everything becomes teleological, I believe it becomes near tyrannical. So I am not a believer that every single thing in the entire universe is teleological. I think that water likes to move the way that water likes to move, and I think that that is okay. And I think in our own movement in the world, or in our own being as such in the world, um, I think it's okay to not be teleological sometimes and to not be so overly goal oriented. The problem with AI is that the question becomes, how do I solve a problem the fastest way with the least amount of caloric burn with my brain, right? The evolutionary idea is it's kind of like when you're a triathlete. It's funny because I did an Ironman when I was 25, and you're burning
Of
thousands
course
and
you did.
thousands of calories. Yeah, yeah, right. I just like experiences. I love to experience what it means to be human. And the thing about running a triathlon is that your body becomes instead of maximizing on more strength, your body will actually optimize towards efficiency. So when we use AI too much neurologically, calorically, it's just so much less calories to use AI. And so I believe that we tend to want to keep returning to it. And then AI winds up becoming a substitute for having the experience, because why have the experience when I can just get the dopamine hit
Yeah.
from from getting where I want to go from A to B as fast as possible.
We end up
And
we end up consuming, and I think that's the temptation, probably of all humanity everywhere, but particularly in our time, in our generation, the temptation to be and live and function and to spend our lives as consumers. I think the single biggest anthropological threat. And AI
yeah,
is just going to offer us again the little treats, the goodies, the substitute experience rather than going out and doing it. I
Yeah.
never did Ironman. I ran a half marathon once when I was younger and thinner, and it was worth doing just for doing it. AI is never going to be able to run that for me. It can help me
No, no, no,
imagine the
no.
route, but it cannot help me. It cannot get my legs pumping.
No, and there's a brilliant book by a gal. My daughter is 14. We're going through this book. It's called Tiny Experiments by Anne Laure Lecomte, I think, and she's a neuroscientist. And one of the great things that we've been kind of going through is this difference between information and knowledge. That there's an infinite amount of information, but knowledge is really what helps me to get to my goal, right? Helps me to get to where I want to go. And so we can become, I think, paralyzed is a good word by just forgetting that, or by thinking that we need more information than we need, because information used to be a source of food for us. It used to be a source of, what would make things work, how to survive, right? If I knew where food was going to come from, or if I knew where water was going to come from, then I wouldn't, that information would literally be life to me. But nowadays, I believe that limiting and suppressing the amount of information we take in, or maintaining a low information diet, but a high knowledge diet, are very
And,
different.
and maybe we as Christians would even go one step further and talk about wisdom.
Of course.
Yeah, what do we do with the knowledge? So we do not want to trade just one addiction for another. We don't want to make
No.
AI, have the support groups for AI addictions here, 5 years from now, to mirror what we've done with other addictions because we
Right.
have an addictive culture.
Right.
We do push the things that will give us the dopamine rush, and then we spend years trying to recover and heal from those kind of things, and we would
Yeah.
not want AI to do that for us.
Well, that's the argument, right? That with wisdom, right, is taking this knowledge and then submitting it to the fear of the Lord, right? That
Mhm.
reverential state. And I think that if we, walking in true wisdom doesn't mean that you're the most brilliant person or that you're the wisest person or whatever, but it's simply to say that the hierarchy of knowledge that gets us to where we ought to go, that has the highest value of iterative games that we could possibly play over and over in the universe. It's like meta information, information, knowledge, wisdom, right? And that wisdom is really that which then submits everything, the totality of who we are and our experiences, to that teleological thing. For what did God make me for? What are
Uh,
we making together? What are God and I doing together?
and then it keeps us humble too, because
Exactly.
otherwise we end up with the arrogance of information. Knowledge puffs up, love builds up, right? Isn't that scripture?
Hmm.
And we've seen it in nearly every aspect of education, including Christian higher education. We get the degrees, we know more than somebody else, and we become arrogant rather than being in awe of the mystery of what we don't know. And that's where the insatiable curiosity comes in. It's not in what I have accumulated in terms of knowledge. It's bowing down in awestruck wonder at what at what is still mystery and will ever remain so for me. And
Yeah.
that's wisdom. But you get the last word here, Drew. We're going to finish up this part of our conversation. Anything you would distill this down to recommend to those who are listening in?
Yeah. Yeah. Be careful with how much friction you reduce in terms of becoming who you are. That you want to become who you are with the right amount of weight, the right amount of resistance, um, to really begin to explore who God made you to be and to operate with wisdom, to not say we need to throw all of this out, but to operate in wisdom and say, how can I incorporate this with curiosity and passion and discipline to really move the kingdom forward? And I think that's the great question we're all trying to figure out. And new technology is always a new information, a new opportunity for us to present the gospel in some new ways. Let's not forget that part of the reason that Christianity took off when it did was because of the centralized location of the Christians there in Jerusalem. So, really important stuff to consider that AI is at that center of the crossroads of trade as well.
Thank you, Drew. And if somebody did want to find your speedily written book, Where would they find it? In the coming
Right now, you
weeks.
would just message me on LinkedIn. I'm still debating on how I want to push it out, whether I'm going to keep it industry specific, but Purple Squirrel Paradox, and you can find me on LinkedIn, just Drew Littlejohns.
Very good. Well, before we started the Imagination podcast, I was hosting weekly imagination sessions. We've been doing this for several years. You're the first ever alumnus of the program who's come on in that role to say, "Hey, this is something I've learned along the way," and
Yep.
I hopefully our audience will understand why I invited you to be the first.
Well,
Love your spirit. I love the energy, and I particularly love the curiosity. Thank you for giving us some really good stuff to think about today, Drew.
yeah, thanks
Okay.
for having me, man.